The Dow dropped 500 points yesterday, not because of the Supreme Court ruling, because of what happened 90 minutes after it. At 10 o'clock Friday morning, 6 justices of the United States Supreme Court told Donald Trump that his signature economic weapon was illegal. By noon, markets were rallying, investors were celebrating. Analysts were calling it the end of the tariff era. And by 2 o'clock, Trump walked to a podium in the White House, called the ruling deeply disappointing, said he was ashamed of the justices he personally appointed, and announced he was signing a brand new 10% global tariff using a completely different law. Same afternoon, same building, same man, different statute. The Dow reversed, 500 points gone. And every government on earth that had spent the morning popping champagne quietly put the bottles away and started reading Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. But that's not the story. The story is happening in Ottawa right now. Because while every cable news anchor spent Friday debating whether the Supreme Court ruling was a victory or a defeat, Mark Carney's team was doing math. And the math says something that nobody in Washington wants to hear. This ruling didn't weaken Trump's tariff war against Canada. It weakened Trump's tariff war against everyone else. And that distinction is about to reshape the entire global trade landscape in ways that make Canada's position either dramatically stronger or dramatically more dangerous, depending on what happens in the next 150 days. Let me show you what I mean. Before Friday's ruling, Canada had something no other country on earth had, a competitive advantage built on pain. Because of CUSMA, the trade agreement Trump himself signed in his first term, roughly 90% of Canadian exports to the United States crossed the border completely tariff-free. The EA tariffs that hit the rest of the world at rates up to 35% didn't touch most Canadian goods. That gap, the difference between what Canada paid and what Europe, Asia, and South America paid, was Canada's moat. It made Canadian goods cheaper on American shelves than competing products from countries facing Liberation Day rates. The Supreme Court just drained that moat by striking down EA tariffs globally. The rest of the world suddenly gets relief that Canada already had. European manufacturers who are paying 35% now face 10% under Trump's replacement order, or potentially nothing if Section 122 gets challenged in court. South Korean semiconductor firms, Vietnamese textile exporters, Brazilian agricultural producers, they all just got a massive discount. And Canadian exporters who thought they had a structural edge are now watching that edge evaporate in real time. RBC Economics published an analysis within hours of the ruling that said it plainly. If the EA tariffs are not replaced at similar levels, other countries could see significant tariff reductions, and Canada could lose its status as the lowest tariff U.S. trade partner. The removal of EA tariffs, they wrote, is actually a negative for Canada's competitive position. Think about what that means. The Supreme Court ruling that was supposed to help Canada might actually hurt it. Not because Canada pays more, because everyone else pays less. And when the playing field levels, geography stops being destiny and price starts being everything. Now, some will say, hold on. Trump immediately slapped a 10% global tariff back on. Problem solved. Canada keeps its COSMA advantage. And on paper, the White House fact sheet confirms it. Cosmic compliant goods are exempt from the new Section 122 levy, so the moat survives. But here's what the fact sheet doesn't tell you. Section 122 has a kill switch built into the law, 150 days. That's the maximum duration a president can impose tariffs under this authority without congressional approval. 150 days from February 24th lands in late July, the exact same window as the CUSMA review, the exact same moment when the United States, Canada, and Mexico sit down to decide whether the trade agreement that governs $3.5 billion in daily cross-border commerce gets extended for another 16 years or begins to die. And here's the trap. If Congress doesn't vote to extend the Section 122 tariffs, they expire. Trump loses his replacement weapon. But if Congress does vote to extend them, that vote becomes the first time in modern history that the legislature formally endorses a presidential tariff regime that the Supreme Court just said was being pursued through illegal means. Every Republican who votes yes does so 9 weeks before midterm elections in districts where 60% of voters already oppose tariff policy. And the Tax Foundation says the average household is paying over $1,000 a year in tariff taxes. That's not a policy choice. That's a political minefield, and both sides know it. Which is why what India did this month suddenly matters more than anyone expected. 2 weeks before the Supreme Court ruling, India signed a framework deal with Trump. Tariffs on Indian exports dropped from 50% to 18%. India pledged $500 billion in purchases of American energy, aircraft, and technology over 5 years. Indian conservatives celebrated, and then the ruling dropped, and the reaction from New Delhi was immediate regret. Indian trade analysts, some previously connected to the government, publicly stated that India should have waited, that if they had held off just 2 weeks, they could have negotiated from a position where American tariff leverage had been cut by the judiciary, instead of locking in concessions under duress. Canada waited. Canada refused every invitation to rush, to Mar-a-Lago. Carney never picked up the phone to negotiate under pressure. His critics called it arrogant. His opponents called it reckless. And on Friday, February 20th, 2026, CIBC's chief economist confirmed what Carney's team had calculated all along. With the EA tariffs struck down, the United States has lost leverage, and Canada's negotiating position in the CUSMA talks is somewhat improved. Patience as strategy. A former central banker outweighing a real estate mogul. The man who spent a career calculating risk, premiums just watched Trump's biggest asset get marked down by the highest court in the land. And he didn't have to give up a single concession to make it happen. But don't mistake patience for celebration, because Ottawa isn't celebrating. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the country's largest business lobby, issued a statement within hours that should chill anyone who thinks this fight is winding down. This ruling is not the last chapter of this never-ending story. Canada should prepare now for new, blunter mechanisms to be used to reassert trade pressure, potentially with broader and more disruptive effects. That's the business community talking, not politicians, not pundits, the people who sign paychecks and manage supply chains. And they're right, because what Trump revealed on Friday afternoon isn't just a backup plan, it's a doctrine. He told reporters he has great alternatives that are even stronger than EA. He said Congress has already approved the authority he needs. He announced that Trade Representative Jameson Greer will immediately launch Section 301 investigations into countries whose trade practices Washington considers unreasonable. Section 232 investigations into additional imports that might threaten national security, and the existing Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and automobiles remain completely untouched by the Supreme Court ruling. Those tariffs were never part of this case. They remain in full force today, and they account for the bulk of the economic damage Canadian workers have absorbed over the past year. The Section 232 tariffs are the wound that won't close. $15.5 billion in Canadian exports affected through 2025 alone. Steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, the sectors that employ real people in real towns across Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta. The Supreme Court ruling didn't touch a single one of those tariffs, and Trump's press conference made clear he intends to expand them, not shrink them. This is the Hydra problem. You cut off one head, two grow back, EA dies. Section 122 appears the same afternoon. Section 122 expires in 150 days. Section 232 and 301 investigations are already spinning up to replace it. Each new authority comes with different rules, different timelines, different legal vulnerabilities. But the intent never changes. The tariffs keep coming. Only the statutory box on the form changes. And this is where the 150-day clock becomes the most important countdown in global economics. Here's what converges. In that window, the Section 122 tariffs expire in late July without congressional action. The Kuzma Review formally begins. July 1st, midterm campaign season enters its final stretch. And Janice Charette, the two-time clerk of the Privy Council who recommended invoking emergency powers during the convoy crisis, sits across from Jameson Greer with more leverage than any Canadian negotiator has carried into that room since NAFTA was signed. Because Charette now walks into the KSMA review knowing three things she didn't know a week ago. First, the Supreme Court has established that a president cannot unilaterally impose sweeping tariffs through emergency declarations. That's precedent. That's constitutional law. And it means the nuclear option threatening to blow up Kuzma and reimpose universal tariffs just lost its warhead. Second, Section 122 dies on its own in 150 days. And the political cost of extending it through Congress is prohibitive heading into midterms. Third, every alternative authority Trump reaches for requires investigations, findings, public comment periods, and agency processes that take months. The speed and flexibility that made so dangerous are gone. What remains is slower, more constrained, and more vulnerable to legal challenge. Carney spent 12 months building the alternatives for exactly this moment. Trade agreements on 4 continents. A defense industrial strategy that routes 70% of military procurement away from American contractors. A strategic partnership with China on agriculture and electric vehicles. Negotiations with India, ASEAN, Mercosur, and the European Union. The EU CPTP bridge that would create a 1.5 billion person trading bloc without the United States at its center. Every one of those agreements was dismissed as theater by Washington. Every one of them was called posturing by critics who said Canada could never replace the American market. And every one of them just became more valuable because the Supreme Court ruling didn't just constrain Trump. It told every government on earth that the legal foundation of American tariff supremacy has a crack in it, and cracks in foundations don't get smaller, they get bigger. Here's what this means for your life right now. If you're American, the $133 billion collected under tariffs is now in legal limbo. Trump was asked directly whether companies would get refunds. His answer was that it would need to be litigated for the next 2 years. Translation: the money you overpaid on imported goods, the $1,000 the tax foundation calculated per household, that money is sitting in government coffers, and the president has no intention of giving it back voluntarily. Companies can sue, importers can file claims, but you, the consumer who paid higher prices at the register, are almost certainly never seeing a check. The money moved through too many hands. The chain is too long. The mechanism to trace a tariff search charge from a shipping container to your charge from a shipping container to your grocery cart doesn't exist. If you work, grocery cart doesn't exist. If you work in manufacturing, the sectors trump in manufacturing. The sectors Trump swore these tariffs would protect, have hemorrhaged jobs. The trade deficit hemorrhaged jobs. The trade deficit barely budged. The Dow dropped 500 barely budged. The Dow dropped 500 points on the same day the court ruled points on the same day the court ruled in importers' favor, because investors understood instantly that the uncertainty isn't ending, it's evolving. Uncertainty isn't ending, it's evolving. Your supply chain isn't stabilizing. Your supply chain isn't stabilizing. It's entering a new phase of instability built on different legal authorities with different expiration dates and different vulnerabilities. And if you're watching from any capital that trades with both the United States and anyone else, you just got the most important signal of 2026. The American judiciary will check the American executive, but the American executive will immediately root around that check. The tariffs don't die, they mutate. And the only durable protection against mutation is diversification. That's what Canada understood before anyone else. That's what 12 months of deal-making across 4 continents was designed to prepare for. Not a single ruling, not a single vote. The structural reality that American trade policy is now permanently unstable, regardless of which statute underwrites it, regardless of which court reviews it, regardless of which party controls Congress. Watch 3 things. First, watch the Section 122 clock. 150 days. Every day that ticks past without congressional extension brings the automatic expiration closer. And every day closer to expiration weakens the leverage Trump carries into the Kuzma review. Second, watch whether Trump expands Section 232 designations to cover new Canadian product categories, energy, agriculture, critical minerals, as a backdoor to reimposing the pressure the Supreme Court just removed. If Canadian oil or potash suddenly becomes a national security threat to the United States, you'll know the Hydra is growing its next head. Third, watch what happens when the refund claims start hitting the Court of International Trade. Because if the government fights every claim individually, dragging the process into years of litigation, that tells you everything about whether this administration views the Supreme Court as a constraint or an inconvenience. A family-owned toy company from Illinois called Learning Resources just defeated the most powerful executive on earth in front of 9 justices. They make counting bears for first graders. Trump called them sleaze bags. They won anyway. And within 90 minutes, the president announced he was doing the same thing again with a different law, attacking his own Supreme Court nominees as a disgrace to their families on live television. That's not a man who accepts defeat. That's a man who changes weapons. And across the border, a former central banker who spent 12 months being mocked for refusing to pick up the phone is now sitting in the strongest negotiating position any Canadian leader has held in a generation. Not because the court ruled in his favor, but because he built a country that doesn't need to win in an American courtroom to survive. The 150-day clock started ticking on Friday. When it hits 0, either Congress votes to extend tariffs 9 weeks before midterms, or the replacement regime collapses on its own. Either outcome changes the KSMA negotiation. Either outcome reshapes continental trade, and either outcome validates or demolishes the most ambitious bet a Canadian Prime Minister has ever made: that patience, preparation, and alternatives beat bluster, threats, and a social media account. The Supreme Court just told Trump he was using the wrong tool. He picked up another one before the ink was dry. But this time, the tool has an expiration date, and the man across the table has been counting the days since January. Pay attention to the next 150 days, because when the clock hits 0, either the tariff wall holds or it doesn't. And the country that spent 12 months building doors in every other direction will be the first one through. If you want to understand how power actually moves while everyone watches the headlines, subscribe and hit the bell. Drop a comment telling me what concerns you more, the Section 232 expansion or the Kuzma review collision. Because those 2 timelines are about to converge, and I'm watching